Hey guys, so I'm here to share with you today why raising the minimum wage isn't always necessarily a positive and beneficial thing like a lot of people in society would have you believe. And here's why. So this graph, which I'm going to try and go over things in a more technical sense, like with graphs and maybe some numbers even, but I'll also try and weave in some more easy and readily understandable explanations for what's going on. So we have a typical graph, and then over here we're going to have the supply of labor, which I'll denote as SL. So supply of labor is represented here. And the supply of labor in a more general sense would be like your workers, people looking for work, labor supply. That would be kind of like you and me searching for a job. So I'll put workers. And then over here we have the downward sloping demand for labor, which I will denote as D and L here, so demand of labor, which is more like your companies who are doing the hiring. So the people that are in demand of the workers, in demand of the labor. So I'll put businesses. I'll put BIZ to denote businesses. And then over here, along this axis, that would be the equivalent of price. And in this example, when you're talking about labor, price is actually what we would call a wage. So I would put W over here to denote what's happening with the wages along this axis based on the supply and demand of labor. And then over here, just like in the standard supply and demand graph, we're going to have the quantity of labor. So I'll put Q sub L down here for like the quantity of labor demanded, which will be reflected along this axis relative to the supply curve and the demand curve for labor. So let's examine what happens when you have just an efficient market happening where labor supply and labor demand where wages and the quantity of labor are just determined by the supply and the demand for labor. So wherever supply and demand intersect, will be the efficient wage, which we will denote as EW. So here's the point in the graph where supply and demand are equal, and that's where the efficient wage lies, based on the supply of workers and the demand for workers for that given company or given industry. And like I said, that's the efficient wage, which we will denote as EW along the wage axis over here. And we can just, for case of an example, say that the efficient wage is $10 an hour for this particular industry in this particular graph. So if you prefer the numbers, we'll give you a $10 an hour wage right there. And then at the efficient wage where supply and demand intersect, let's say the quantity of labor at that particular intersection is, 100 employees. So now we have your efficient wage, and then here's what happens. Here's where the inefficiency comes into play when you have a price floor that is set above where the efficient wage is. And the price floor in this example is your minimum wage, so to speak. So we're going to go ahead and I'll use a different pen so we can start to see the differences happening here. So I'll use a red pen to denote the minimum wage. So people are out there picketing and trying to, they're trying to do a good thing from what they know, so I'm not necessarily faulting them. But that was my chihuahua sneezing. But at the same time, they're out there trying to get signatures to raise the minimum wage, not realizing that this is what happens when you do it. So we'll take our red pen, and then we will put an MW here for a minimum wage, which is our price floor essentially. That is being set above where the efficient wage is. So again, we'll put MW for minimum wage. And so now you have all of these, in a more, colloquial sense, you have all of these workers out there that are like, oh, awesome, the minimum wage, we'll say now, again, for sake of numbers, and this pen is not doing a good job, so it's like $15 an hour. So you have workers out there and the labor supply, the labor market going, awesome, minimum wage is $15 an hour, so maybe I will go out and get a job now. So labor supply, the increase of labor supply and people looking for jobs because of the minimum wage increase is going to increase as well. So now the quantity of labor supplied, instead of being here where the efficient wage was, now we intersect based on the $15 an hour thing. Now that wage is intersected here for the supply of workers. And so supply, because more people want jobs, because now it's, this pen is not working. I'm so that person right now. Okay, so now that the minimum wage is $15 an hour and more people want jobs because they can get more money, the labor supply increases to, let's just say, 150, because more people are like, yay, more money, let's go out and get more jobs. But businesses, now put yourself in the shoes of the small business that just had the news that the minimum wage is increasing. So now instead of paying their employees an efficient wage of like $10 an hour based on that industry, now they're like, oh crap, now I have to pay these people an extra $5 an hour, which translates to quite a bit of money per hour over time. And so based on that, they are either going to hire fewer workers or pass that cost along to the consumer, depending on the elasticity of demand of that particular industry. So for this example, we will assume that it's a relatively elastic demand. In other words, the business in this case, in this example, the ones demanding labor, so over here on this axis, don't have as much leverage in an elastic demand situation. So they don't have as much leverage to be passing that cost, that additional cost of labor, onto the consumer. So they're just going to hire fewer workers. So instead of their demand for labor based on the efficient wage being 100, which is where the supply of labor is also at the efficient wage, and everyone's happy because supply equals demand, yay, everyone that wants a job gets a job in this situation. Now that businesses no longer want to hire as many people because they can't afford to hire as many people because it eats into their operating costs and their profit margin and potentially even pushes them into insolvency if they really don't have as much leverage in that industry. So now their demand for labor, because labor is that much more expensive at $15 an hour, we'll say is, for the sake of the example, only 50 workers. So now you have this gap between the amount of people who now want a job at $15 an hour versus the businesses who want to supply jobs for these people at $15 an hour. And that gap, that difference, is what we call unemployment. So, like, a lot of people don't realize that when you put a minimum wage, a price floor above where the efficient wage is, you do create unemployment because supply and demand are not allowed to determine what the efficient wage is. You are artificially selecting what the wage is going to be in the economy. Now, another scenario that occurs outside of, again, when it comes back to the leverage that that particular company and that particular business has with their customers. So a company that's going to have more leverage and more of an inelastic demand, instead of just hiring fewer people, they're like, okay, well, I'll keep the amount of people I have, or I'll hire the same amount of people as I want. I'm just going to now pass that increase in cost that I'm incurring from having to pay them more money onto the consumer. So that's where you get the reverberation throughout the entire economy, potentially, depending on the industry it's affecting, of prices going up because the cost that the business is incurring, like let's say you're a business owner, now you have to, it's going to cost you more to hire people and to employ people. And let's say you have a lot of leverage and you can pretty much, like you have a good or service, like a good example is the inelastic demand of a utility company. Like, let's say you're the only utility company in town. It's just, you got news that it's now going to cost you more money to run your utility business, but there's no other competitors. There's not a lot holding you back from passing that cost on. There's not a lot of repercussions for passing that cost on to the consumers. So now, flip it and put yourself in the consumer's point of view. Now you're going to be paying more for utilities. So yeah, maybe you were earning a minimum wage and you were excited initially because now instead of earning $10 an hour as a minimum wage worker, you're now earning $15 an hour as a minimum wage worker. That's a great little thing, but then a couple months later, as the whole effect reverberates throughout the economy, you're going to be paying more for goods and services from companies that are passing that expense on to you. So you end up paying for it one way or another. It's just you don't necessarily see that in the beginning, and a lot of people don't see it at all. But that's why it's good to think a little bit more carefully about what's going on around you and the consequences of your actions, because a lot of people don't realize how significant they can be. And this graph, this example, is a prime example of that. So I'm not saying to not advocate for a minimum wage. Free will is amazing, do whatever you want. I just hope now you have a little bit more knowledge when you're walking into the grocery store and people are, harassing you for signatures on increasing the minimum wage. Now you have a better understanding of why that may or may not resonate with you as a good thing.